Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you. This is the fourth and final week with Professor Paul Liptz. Reminder, there is no class on Friday, May 31st. And then starting in June, we learn with Rabbi Steve Moss on traditions and customs related to death and burial and mourning. It has been an incredible month with Paul. He's one of the greatest teachers out there in Israel. I was blessed to have him at rabbinical school and as my work with NIFTY in Israel as a guide. And he's a beloved teacher to many. And the technology lets him be with us here for the month. Just a reminder, he has lectured at Tel Aviv University, Hebrew Union College, and around the world, translating complex issues and realities into a language we can understand. And you've seen that this month, taking the protest movement in Israel and highlighting some particular protests. It's been so interesting to watch how the country moved from protesting as a unit together to the outside world to now internal protests, of which this is certainly one of them. And this is really bigger than Israel. This is in the Jewish world at large. So, Paul, it's been a pleasure. I'm going to hand things over to you. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. It's good afternoon. It's good to be with everyone. This is going to be a different kind of session because until now, there were political leaders involved, initially Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin, and then Golda Meir, and then Yitzhak Rabin. So what we've got as our fourth one, after discussing the possibilities with your rabbi, was to try and take a sort of a very different kind of approach. And this is a much broader one. This is the whole question of women involved in protest. And just a comment or two about myself and women's issues, gender issues. Many years ago at Tel Aviv University, I'd been in the faculty maybe a few years, 10 years or so, and I started going through the course outline of the university for the Israeli students, the Hebrew program, and I realized in a very large university, the second largest university in Israel, there were almost no courses connected with women. This is now, say, 30 years ago. So I decided that it seemed to be such an important point. And in addition to which, at the end of one of my courses, when we did a summary, one of the students said to me, I very much enjoyed the course. It was actually on Arab nationalism, but I never hardly ever heard the word women. And that, the two things that neither was the university dealing with women's issues, which are very different now, by the way, and here in my own classes, I hadn't been aware of it, forced me into a very serious study, which led to 25 years of giving a course on women in Arab society. So that really brought me to gender issues. So I carried on and became very, very involved. And I'm always excited when I do this kind of topic. So what I'm going to do is a very different approach because we're talking about a significant number of relatively small organizations who each had an impact in a different kind of way. This is also a recognition of the complexity of Israeli society. We know your American society is very complex and Israel is very complex, as are many countries in the world. And so what I'm going to try and do is in a very chronological way, because there were different developments which increased and changed with a period of time, starting in 1984 to the last and maybe the most important women's protest movement we've ever had, which is the Women Wage Peace Organization. So I want to start off with really an amazing person, Professor Alice Shelby. Here we see a picture of Alice, who wrote this book, which was a total surprise when it came out. I just couldn't believe it. She called it Never a Native. Well, for me, Alice, and I know her well, I'd met her on a number of occasions. I'd listened to some of her lectures. Alice seemed to be so unbelievably involved in Israeli society. That was why, so when she wrote her autobiography, the title was quite unusual. But I think Alice's background really explains to a large extent why she was really one of the formative women protest leaders. Now, there'd obviously been other women at various stages who had spoken about women's issues, glass ceiling, all the, abortion, the rape, all those terrible things that happen in societies. But Alice was really the person who said, it's no good as individuals protesting. We have to form an organization. And I think her background, firstly coming from Germany, then Orthodox parents, and she herself changed very much. She found Orthodox wasn't what she really wanted. And at a later stage, she moved much closer to the conservative movement. In 1949, she made Aliyah, just a year after the state had been made. She became a professor of English, and in her autobiography, she writes about the tremendous male chauvinism which she herself felt that, until they accepted that a woman could be a professor of English, took a lot of pushing. And she did something which was very unusual. She essentially set up a religious high school, the Pelach Religious High School, which, unlike any other Orthodox or modern Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox institution that I know, she actually encouraged the women to serve in the army, or at least to go into national service. So she was very much part of Israeli society. And her final job was as rector of the Shecht Institute of Jewish Studies. So Ella set up this women's network. The terminology is very good. And we can see here some of the main issues which she tried to deal with as time went by. And I think the important thing about Alice was not only that she was head of the network, but she was a mentor to many of the women who at a later stage in Israeli society would become very much involved in trying to deal with some very important women's issues. So there was the gender, overall gender inequality, the issue of lack of quality. She was very much aware of anti-sexual harassment legislation. She wanted equal pay. What she succeeded in doing, and this was really maybe the first time that women managed to move to the wider Israeli public, was in 1986 when she managed to get large audiences to turn up to discuss with her the topic which had somehow or other been put on the side of Israeli society. She's very concerned with divorce issues, and in 1988, she was involved in Torah reading at the Western Wall. We know as time went by, and it'll come up a little later, and I believe you people had some contact with that Women of the Wall phenomenon. She really said, women should be allowed to pray at the Western Wall just like men. And this, as we know, remains a major issue of controversy until today. She was certainly interested and involved in the question of sex trafficking. 1996, actually, in the 1990s, there were a considerable number of Russian-speaking immigrants who came into the country, almost 1 million, in the 1990s. And at the same time, very unfortunately, the issue of women's trafficking came in. It was a genuine issue. The State Department had actually mentioned that as well. And the most unfortunate thing is that quite quickly a stereotype developed about who Russian-speaking women were. And we know that stereotypes of society are very hard to move away. And Alice was fighting against many of the stereotypes connected to women. She, as I mentioned, found traditional prayers hard to swallow, although she herself saw herself as an Orthodox person for an extended period of time. She spoke about the need to separate state and religion. That, by the way, didn't get off the ground. And she had very, very clear political ideas. And she said openly, and she writes in a book, we should never have become an occupation government. So we find Alice as clearly on the political left, stating issues which, as time went by, when governments moved to the left or the right, would be a major issue for discussion. A few years later, there was a reaction to Alice Shelby, and to this leftist anti-occupation movement. And this came from the movement Gush Emunim. The Gush Emunim was the most successful non-Knesset protest group that we've ever had. So they were very close to politics, but they were not directly at an early stage in particular involved in the Knesset. The firebrand woman, and I say this in a positive sense, was Daniela Vice, amazing orator, filled with energy. I mean, I remember listening to her at some of the demonstrations. She was, she would come out of the podium into the audience, not physically, but her, you can see her body action, those eyes would open up. She was very, very expressive. She had amazing ability to use her hands as a talking mechanism. So she was born in Bnei Brak, an Israeli-born woman of American immigrants. And here I mention it because it's quite interesting to see that in the women's movement, there were a considerable number who actually either came from overseas or from family members who were overseas, not only the United States, from many other countries as well. So this says something interesting about, where some of these people may have been affected. She became a mayor of a West Bank settlement. And Daniela Vice's idea, unlike Alice, who essentially stayed within the core groups of Israel, Daniela Vice was out in the open. And at the age of 60 years old in 2005, she completed a 12-kilometer trek to protest against the planned retreat from Gaza. So Daniela Vice, as a mechanism, was being part of the audience and being out there. Physically, she felt it was very important. And by the way, she was not passive. In 2007, she was charged with obstructing and assaulting a police officer. And she was put on 5 months probation. A year later, she was once again arrested and released. So here's it's kind of someone whose approach very much differs from Alice Shelby. She was the outstanding part of Daniela Vice was the question of territories, where, as Shelby said, we should not be an occupation country in the territories. Daniela Vice had said exactly the opposite, and she was out there all the time trying to develop new settlements. Where does she base her ideology from? Because she has a very strong religious ideology. She writes in one particular source, literally it was the revival of the biblical narrative. Daniela Vice lived the Bible, lived Tanakh. It was part of who she was. So to return to it was to return to the glory of the past history of the Jewish nation. She made one very interesting comment, which was up for grabs, and some people disagreed with her from her own movement in terms of the Palestinians. She made a comment that those who accept Israel's sovereignty should stay. She's speaking about the Palestinians who live in the territories. They could be offered passports, but only if they pass tests of loyalty and devotion to the state of Israel. And that code, loyalty and devotion, actually means never oppose government policy. So it was clear that although on one level it seemed that she was interested in the Palestinians being part of Israeli society, the loyalty and devotion phrase somehow works against it. Then came the return to the left after Daniela Vice, and I think Daniela Vice actually pushed for a new kind of organization, very, very different. The women in black against the occupation. So we see Daniela Vice not only for the occupation, but in the territories all the time. Here we find with the women in black, different kind of organization. They were around for 6 years, and then they came back for 1998 to 2011. Now, here we can see the women in black wanted to perhaps catch on to something which Daniela Vice had told them, explained to them, is that you have to be visually active. The body language, the signs, the posters, all of which Daniela Vice had used, became very much part of the women in black. Here they're writing signs in 3 different languages. In English, stop the occupation, or end the occupation, 50 years of occupation. Who were these women? And this is a new kind of clientele which is going out. Firstly, they decided that they would be a Friday mid-morning protest movement in the main cities of the country, and particularly Jerusalem, by the way. And we ourselves lived in Jerusalem at that time, so I would often see them at these demonstrations. They would be there a little bit before 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock in almost 30 locations, kind of was the women in black time. And what they were concerned about was what they felt the occupation was all about. And they were using the term moral corruption of Israeli society. They didn't have a great influence. And it seems to be that one of the reasons why their influence was not so great is that they were very much identified with women who were very well educated, middle class, secular, Ashkenazi, middle class, well educated, and often ex-youth movement. Now, this kind of terminology at a certain time in Israeli history was very much almost, it displayed a kind of a sense of elitism. And because the women in black were seen as somewhat elitist, very close at an earlier period of history with the Labour Party, they really attracted a limited amount of attention, although they were very active, but they found themselves, as we would see here on the slide, in some very difficult situations. And I'm just going to use one quote. Sorry to get to this level, but it's important. But I remember I would often, because I was so interested in the question of women protest, I would be at women protest occasions right through the country. And I remember listening to cab drivers in particular, who just one of many, many expressions was, "You should be raped by Arabs." Terrible comments which were used against women. We know this is a global phenomenon. I've studied women protest movements and the response of society in various countries of the world. And there seems to be something about the male, but not only males, women as well, who actually use a very awful language, not respecting the fact that these women are protesting because they have a particular feeling on an issue. And in some cases, it even got more violence. There was gunshots pretty near about it. And although they were out there, I think they had a very important place. But in the big picture, and certainly in the political realms, their influence was less important. Here we come to yet a totally different kind of movement with Anat Hoffman. We see Anat Hoffman here. And many of these people from Hebrew Union College, from the Reform movement, people who I personally know. Certainly here I can see 5 or 6 faces of people. The women of the wall, of the Western Wall, started not with Reform movement or conservative movement people, but rather from Rivka Haut, an Orthodox woman who had been at a conference, the first international conference for Jewish feminists held at the Hebrew University. By the way, very important conference, because it started much of sort of giving an intellectual tone to women's rights. It kind of took on a new kind of format. And after that, by the way, many women's studies organizations started appearing at various universities. And Rivka Haut, kind of maybe a little bit unaware of what might be the response, decided on a collective prayer. And starting from 1988 until the present day, in fact, until last week, you have a violent riot by Haredi men. Here we see the Haredi men. Here we see some of the Haredi men. Here we see some of these Haredi men, ultra-Orthodox, Haredi ultra-Orthodox, who would spit, curse, and pull the hair of women there, as well as trying to grab the Torah. Violence in the arena of the Western Wall, a holy place. And here you have this deep contradiction which goes on today, not only in terms of women protest movement, but in terms of many other things that carry on in Jerusalem. In a city which is perceived as being a holy city, is tragically a city of a tremendous amount of violence. Women of the Wall, although it's seen to a large extent because of Anat Hoffman, who's so closely involved in the Women Reform Organization, also included Orthodox, conservative, even secular women. The women, this whole question of how you present yourselves, the women of the Western world were going to present themselves making a major statement. And this was prayer shawls, which one doesn't even ask the question in an American reform or conservative temple synagogue, that women, if they want, can wear a talit. Here we find that the women wearing the talit, and in some cases the tefillin, really was a statement which was following the trend of Daniela Vice and the Western Wall to say, we have to be seen, that as long as we women are somewhere on a corner of a street just shouting without any visual message, that isn't going to work. So here became the three very important visual messages: talit, or four in fact: talit, kippah, tefillin, and the Torah scrolls. The women, these four women, and certainly Anat Hoffman, they, unlike obviously the women of the Western Wall, the women in black were out there every Friday. The women of the Wall chose a very, very, obviously the beginning of the Jewish month, and that itself became very important. Now, the importance of timing is that because it was going to be the beginning of each month, Jewish month, the stage was set. And you therefore have people on both sides, women of the Wall getting ready for it, and sometimes men would, Reform and conservative Orthodox men would go out and support them. And at the same time, the opposition, the ultra-Orthodox, mainly ultra-Orthodox, but sometimes modern Orthodox as well, they were all prepared for the timing. So here the stage is set. From a certain perspective, it becomes very volatile because the stage is set. You know physically where it's always going to be, in one place and one place only. The alternative part of the wall that the Reform and conservative movements have wanted so badly still are not part of a reality. And at the same time, it's not only the place, but the timing. So this is also so very important. We see a poll in 2016, which says something very important about Israeli society. The poll said that 62% of Israeli Jews supported women's collective prayer and Torah reading at the women's section. So that's 2/3 of Israelis didn't see these women at the wall as being anything extreme, but acceptable. 2/3 of Israeli society. But what happens in terms of protest movements globally? There's always the danger, and you people know from the United States, that the issue has to be very sharp to bring out probably 95% of any population. So here there was a phenomenon going on. Israeli society saw it. It was always very much in the television screens, but the silent majority wasn't there. It wasn't the kind of issue that most Israelis would actually attend, although we can see exactly where their own support concepts were. We then go to the other side. We see the ball is being thrown backwards and forwards. Alice Shelby on the left, to the right, to the left. And here we go to women in green, who actually chose their name because green represents the soil, the building of the land of Israel, the desert. Suddenly women would become very, very physical. By the way, they took advantage of the role of early women in the Zionist period from 1905 onwards, who a few years later in 1909 started building the kibbutz movement. and were very physical. So here, women in green, on the one hand, did in fact a very interesting activity, pulling together, firstly, biblical concepts. They used biblical language all the time. Then they took hold of the Zionist concept, the building of the land and making the lands fertile and green. And then they actually were out there in a very, very physical way. This particular organization was really the result of two women, Ruth Matar, we see her picture here, and her daughter-in-law, Nadia. Now, I never actually got to listen to Ruth, but in terms of a comment I made earlier, Ruth was born in Belgium into a non-religious family, which is quite unusual. And she was very eloquent, but I heard Nadia Matar on a number of occasions. I was actually at a number of meetings, quite small meetings that she was speaking. She was very eloquent. She had a way of talking that you really had to listen. There was no way that you couldn't pay attention to her. She had that powerful body language, and she was extremely fluent. So she moved the whole dialogue once again to the early biblical period. And therefore, what we find with protest movements, that women in the right organizations, the settler organizations in some occasions, drew their basic sources from Tanakh. Women from the left tended by and large to be very much influenced by global feminist movements. And although every now and again Alice Shelby would use some biblical concepts, the push to the left came from the global perspective, and the right essentially from a very Israeli Jewish biblical kind of concept. They were outraged by the Oslo Accords, which we discussed last week. And the idea for them was, under no condition should we give back any territory. The territory which Israel, from their perspective, legitimately acquired after the Six-Day War in 1967, that territory is Israeli territory. We freed the territory. This was the kind of overall idea. Their activities, once again, the way that protest movements present their viewpoint is important. Every year at Tisha B'Av, they encircle the whole of the old city. Very powerful ideas. They spoke about, and this was just how expansionist they were. They didn't only believe that we should keep the territories which Israel liberated in 1967, but they used something much greater, a kind of terminology, which has pretty much been forgotten in Israeli society, except in a small number of cases. And this is the unification of all the land from the Nile to the Euphrates over there in Iraq. The terminology of dreams, of expansionist dreams, was probably most clearly stated by the women in green, maybe more than just about any other kind of organization. They spoke about expelling Israeli Arabs, a comment which Meir Kahane had mentioned many years earlier, and they regarded the Palestinian as squatters. They believed that because of the leftist Labour Party, the Zionist dream has turned into a Zionist nightmare. For one particular moment, we see a different aspect of women in green, and I think it's always important to pick comments which are somewhat contradictory from mainstream terminology, which they used. Was in 2012, they spoke about citizenship to Palestinians if they sign an oath of loyalty to Israel. By the way, this was dropped. They then didn't even carry on. They didn't expect it. To incorporate large numbers of Palestinians into Israeli society would be something that they could never accept. Image is important. Here we see women with the tools of developing the land. Back to the left in a different kind of way. Here we have an organization which came out of, in a sense, out of the blue. It developed in 1997 at a particular period of the Lebanese war. Now, the Israeli presence in Lebanon had started in 1982. I myself was a soldier in Lebanon at that period, right until 1997. So the Lebanese presence in the Israeli presence in Lebanon has always been very, very controversial. Sometimes, by the way, even crossed political lines. Some people on the left said it's important to be there. We have to be in the southern part of Lebanon to defend Israel. Some people on the right were against it, believing that Lebanon isn't part of the biblical homeland, although there are people who might disagree with that, and therefore we shouldn't be there. So it's the Lebanese issue crossed the regular left-right kind of lines. What was interesting was that these were like the biblical matriarchs, 4 women, Rachel, Miri, Ronit, and Zahara. These 4 women had sons and husbands who had been in the Lebanon war, and they formed an organization which was quite unusual for women's organization, that 40% of their activists were males. Here they actually turned to, in many cases, large numbers of us served in Lebanon. It had been a very difficult, problematic war. The interaction, the conflict with the civilian population was very uncomfortable. I remember it so much from my own experience. Therefore, they managed to bring in considerable number of men who would be supporting what was essentially a women-dominated organization. What brought it to the fore was, although there had been a long-term simmering anger about the presence in Lebanon, was the 1997 helicopter crash on its way to the Lebanese security zone, where 73 military personnel was killed. Well, the issue was, in one situation, you could say it was a tragic helicopter crash. The fact that this was tied up with the Lebanese situation seemed to have been the kind of the final pressure cooker moment where these women said, well, now this is really enough. We've had people killed time after time, and we really have to do something about it. They quickly got organized. They were a very sophisticated organization. This is really a new stage of getting people together on the streets. They had a large number, 600 activists. They within a very short period of time, they received, got 15,000 supporting signatures. They demanded a unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon. The argument going on in Israel at that time was a considerable number of people believed that we shouldn't be in Lebanon, but didn't want a unilateral withdrawal. We wanted an agreement with the Lebanese government that under certain conditions, Israel would remove from the southern zone where Israeli soldiers had been. They defined clearly that this was not about draft resistance or refusal to serve. They felt very committed. Zionist women here said serving in the army is a requirement of our society, and they had attracted quite a large amount of support. But pay attention to the changes. This volatile component which we sometimes see in Israeli society. 2 surveys, well-organized surveys, 1999, we find that 61% of Israelis opposed unilateral withdrawal and 55 favored it. A year later, 2000, 62% favored withdrawal, immediate withdrawal, unilateral withdrawal. And that really, that particular survey, the second survey, convinced the then Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, that this would be the time to withdraw the troops. Therefore, he felt that the 4 mothers, as much as anything else, brought the issue to the wider Israeli public, much broader than any of the other protest organizations that we had seen until then. We come here to a tragic individual story. The story of Vicky Knafo is kind of one of those stories where I think somehow or other, when you get involved in it and you begin to see what was happening, you really see this whole other issue of Israeli society. If we just summarize just for a moment before we come to Vicky, what have I actually been saying at the moment up till now? Up till now, it's really been, to a very large extent, the women's protest movements have been, in many cases, not totally, in many cases, influenced by the question of the territories. To stay in the territories, not to stay in the territories, what would be the role of the Palestinians if they were declared, in inverted commas, loyal. The other issue, which was very much the first stage that we find, was the very much the issue of purely internal women's issues, where women were not being accepted, unequal pay, all the very, very central women kind of concept. And although Alice Shelby had a part of her, which was very much about the territories, not keeping the territories, and for her the occupation was a terrible phenomenon, she had really been quite unusual at the early stage by staying very much within the women's environment. I've no doubt that if Alice was involved in America, she would have a great deal to say about the abortion issues. Here we have a total break from what it seemed to be until 2013, the way that women's organizations would be formed. And it's really Vicky Knafo, one woman, between July the 2nd and September the 23rd in 2003, achieved which in an unusual event, both in terms of how she did it and in terms of who she herself is, to attract vast interest in a very, very particular issue. And her issue was that she had worked as a single mother of three, as a part-time cook in Mitzperamon, a southern town at that time in 2003, a very small, poorly developed town. Today, it's gone through tremendous change. And her battle was essentially in the name of single mothers. Now, for years and years and years, the Ministry of Welfare and the Ministry of Finance has recognized that single mothers are in a particular kind of situation, but it's been almost impossible to change legislation for one reason or the other, and I've actually no understanding of why it really didn't move. But Vicky Knafo was one of those people. Her protest movement was her own, speaking for other single mothers, and there's no shortage of that phenomenon in Israeli society. And in a strange situation, whereas there'd been little support for it, the government even decided to cut the welfare amount, which is unbelievable. There was, until today, I'm not quite sure which voices in the government were thinking in this kind of situation, so much so that the figures were showing that 1/3 of single-parent families were in poverty, under the poverty datum line, which is low in Israel. Vicky, on her own, with her part-time job, decided that she would walk 200 kilometers to Jerusalem. Now, when she started her walk in July in Israel is awfully hot. And her whole idea was, when she started this 200-kilometer walk, she started, by the way, initially with a very small number of people, but Israeli society couldn't get over it. There were these pictures on the television. We see Vicky here very, very deliberately holding the Israeli flag, saying the flag as being a symbol of, I am a central part of Israeli society. I'm not against anyone. I'm here as a central kind of person. And we see her supporters around her. We see this, there was an article wrapped in the flag of Israel. We see these pictures over here. And she started this walk. What she wanted, and she was very specific about it, she wanted this to be a gentle and civilized protest. She had seen some of the things that had been going on, of which a little while ago we mentioned the women at the wall, such a rough, brutal, kind of crude environment which had been set up at the wall. She very much wanted it to be a gentle and civilized protest. This was her personality. And by the time she got to Jerusalem, not far from the Israeli Knesset, she set up what was called in the media Knafo land, Vicky Knafo's area, land, which was in front of the Knesset for over 2 months. And what went on there was something which I remember being so struck by because I've been speaking about the site and the timing and all those sort of things, which are so important in trying to develop a protest movement. She was there for 2 months, sitting there in front of the Knesset, day in and day out. She was supplied by several organizations. She was actually looked after in an amazing kind of way. She'd attracted the soft part of Israeli society. And unlike particularly going back to the one organization which I mentioned, which was extremely Ashkenazi, second or third generation, very well educated women. Here, she represented the Mizrahi, the Eastern Bloc, the North African Sephardi people, and the immigrants. And the comment in one of the better articles that I read noted that she generated an unprecedented public response. The mothers led a struggle of the weakened social peripheries. So here, this is very, very much a movement which hadn't appeared in a very clear way, a movement of the poorer classes. It was an economic kind of movement. By the way, there would later be in 2011 what was called the cottage cheese demonstration. But the cottage cheese demonstration, which hit the headlines when cottage cheese rose above 5 shekel, something in the region of $2, that even in many of the cases, the cottage cheese demonstration were people who could afford the increase of the cottage cheese. Here it touched yet another organization. And to be honest, this was the second organization which was really the organization of the more poverty-stricken formations. The first organization was actually the Black Panther organization of 1952, which was an organization carried out in Jerusalem initially by people who were pretty close to the poverty datum line. Then the issues were dropped for many years, at least in terms of protest, but 2003, it came to the fore. The tragic event of Vicky Knafo. We all saw her face, we knew her. She was on Tel Aviv all the time. She spoke in a very sort of relaxed, non-aggressive way. And in January 2004, short of cash, she posed nude on a website, and on the breasts, her breast was stated, "The state milks single mothers." We can kind of imagine what was happening there. By the way, there were some people who, in trying to analyze what had happened, felt that the tremendous attention she had received in front of the Knesset was almost overwhelming. And then when she went back to her lonely Mitzpeh Ramon environment, that really knocked her as much as anything else. Tragically, in 2005, a year later, her son committed suicide. In 2006, she joined the leftist movement. Until then, she had not been political. She joined the leftist Meretz movement, speaking about peace, and then disappeared, totally disappeared from Israeli society. I've been looking again and again and again. I go through a tremendous amount of material. I'm always wondering and hoping that Vicky Kanafa would once again come back in the public arena. There have been some vague comments about her, but nothing more than that. We're coming here just towards, as we get towards the end of, I want to deal with a kind of almost a summing up until we get to the very last organization of the general phenomenon of violence against women. The violence against women is an ongoing topic within Israel, but kind of always on a low flame. You know, it's kind of one of those things that you look at the media, you read the newspapers, you look at television, listen to the radio, you find that for some reason or other, the violence against women, which is a terrible phenomenon in Israel, and in all the 25 countries that I study, see it again and again. The question has always been, what's the dynamic over here? Because the women recognized that violence against women is so often seen as an individual, a family affair, not broad. The women have tried very, very hard. We can see the images over here, very hard to actually bring the idea in a collective sense, the broad violence against women in the most clear and visual way. And here the image of the blood on the women was once again ensuring that people just wouldn't be able to laugh it off, but to recognize that we're talking about a phenomenon of deep pain. Naamat, the Israeli Women's Organization, gives us a figure a few years ago of over 200,000 women and 500,000 children exposed to domestic violence each year. Unbelievably high figure. In 2016, we find a study by the Ben Gurion University, we have excellent women's studies programs there, that 40% of Israeli women between the ages of 16 and 48 have suffered physical, psychological, or verbal violence from their partners. Shocking kind of statistic. In 2018, and this is when we begin to see, it's very recent that we begin to see some of the protests phenomenon that we see here. And here we have on this sign, "You are not alone." Here they're using some play on words. In 2018, we begin to see much larger women protest movements, but for short periods of time. So this would often be an evening or half a day, very short period of time. It wasn't either because they didn't want to do it or they felt they couldn't do it. I don't know the real reason. They didn't have the ability or the desire to follow through on an ongoing kind of situation. But the figures were always showing us exactly what was going through. 2018, 30,000 cases of domestic violence opened by the police. And we know in many cases, people don't go to the police to complain. So the real figure is much higher, and possibly 75% were closed for lack of evidence. This very problematic reality, which we see in 2020, we begin to see a development of 2018, where the demonstrations against the domestic violence became even larger. And the figures of 2020, once again, horrifying, 60% rise in domestic violence in the last few months. The sign that we saw there was, if there is doubt, there is no doubt. Im yesh safek, ein safek. That means that basically, don't tell us, the woman was saying to the wide Israeli public, don't tell us that this isn't happening, because there is no doubt it is in fact happening. The last group, which really, and I think they, in 2014, managed to bring together, probably in the most dramatic way, which we've seen in all the case studies that I've introduced, an organization which moved further out of Israeli society. Until this particular moment, the women's protest movement had almost totally been an Israeli citizen phenomenon, Israeli Jewish citizen phenomenon, which means Israeli Arab women Palestinian Israelis who live in Israel, Arab women, were not involved in it, and certainly not the Palestinians. 2014 changed that. And this was, once again, as so often happens, a critical event in Israeli society. The Operation Protective Edge in Gaza produced the largest grassroots movement, which until now, it's 8 years after its beginning, remains as active as ever. I'll speak a little bit about some of the women who I know who are involved, who come from the broadest range of Israeli society. They have approximately 44,000 members coming from the right, center, and left, which is what we've never really had. They were religious and secular, whereas maybe the women at the wall would sort of have more of a small number of modern Orthodox, but essentially conservative and reform people. But here it covered the broad range of religious and secular. By the way, I was once at a very big meeting of Women Wage Peace in Ariel in the territories. And in the audience, you would really see very, very clearly that the religious and women were in the same environment. And it included Jews, Arabs, by the way, being Israeli Arabs as well as Palestinians, Druze and Bedouin. Very broad range of women there. And what was their basic doctrine? By the way, they have an excellent website which defines their main theses. It's a well-developed, very sophisticated. By the way, these Women Wage Peace are without doubt the most sophisticated, tremendously clever use of the internet and protest movement. And just to take one of their central themes, to bring about the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by means of an honorable, non-violent, and mutually acceptable agreement with the participation of women from diverse groups of the population in Israel. And as you'll see, if you look at the internet, you'll see the Women Wage Peace spent a great deal of time working on terminology. How would they present themselves? Their challenge was, because in the mind of many people, Women Wage Peace would be a leftist organization, they have tried unbelievably hard to ensure that they're not affiliated to any political party. Now, we don't really know in reality just how great their political influence has been. But if we talk about involvement, we can see this as one of the tremendous marches, thousands and thousands of people of different backgrounds coming together in one of the most unified events that one could ever see in Israeli society, speaking about the desire to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. My very last comment is what I found was a very moving letter by a Palestinian woman living in the territories. And here, by the way, just before I get onto that, you can see the clothing. If you just spend time looking at the kind of clothing, a religious Arab woman, a religious Jewish woman, a more secular woman, perhaps, very, very much saying that we women can come together in a way that apparently men have not done. But to conclude very much with the Palestinian voice, which we certainly don't hear much of in Israeli society, was a letter by a Palestinian woman in April 2021. I want to share with you that my activity is quite exceptional in our Arab society. She, as a woman in Arab society. It takes a lot of courage, self-confidence, and support. Fortunately, my husband, who also believes in peace between the two sides, supports my activity and encourages it to proceed in bringing peace for our children, because I believe in peace, in coexistence, and in cooperation. So on that happier note, where a Palestinian woman comes to the fore, fortunately, in this we find quite often the role of supporting men, husbands, sons, or whatever it can be, can in certain sections of society be very, very crucial. We find this in Israel and in other parts of the world. This is, I think, an important concluding comment, and we have some time for questions.
Paul, thank you so much. I don't know if there's any questions, but this has been incredible. And again, each week, we're coming from a different perspective. First, Israel kind of against the world, and then Israel internally, and now the world of women and how that plays out in Israel. Just a point of note, because I looked up Vicky Knafel, because I drew a conclusion that because of her posing, that her son committed suicide, but it looks like he had a history of violence and abuse. He had abused his girlfriend and had mental issues. So I was like, oh my God, she posed and then he committed suicide, but it doesn't seem like it was. I assumed it was related from the way you presented the information, but I looked and it looks like he had he'd been accused of arrested for violence against a girlfriend, which is so ironic because she's fighting this, the treatment of women. I always remember, and I don't know if it's changed or not, you can go grab your laundry detergent and see, but, in the command form in Hebrew, you have to choose a gender. It's a gendered language, and it was always in the feminine. Laundry detergent directions were to a woman always. And I remember years ago, a woman had done a thesis on that. I don't know if that has changed in Israeli society or if there's still, the cleaning products and the laundry detergent are in the feminine command form.
Well, what happened with that, by the way, almost everything was in the male form at a certain time. So it was actually a kind of a positive situation when you would see the female term coming in. Just to try and to make this a little bit clearer, perhaps, when I started lecturing at the Hebrew University, I was told I was very young and my Hebrew was terrible. I was actually told, don't worry about learning the feminine, because if you have one man in the audience, then you speak in the feminine. Then you speak in the male.
The masculine, yeah.
One man in the audience, you speak in the male. So my very first class, there were only females, no men. So I became very, very aware of gender terminology early on in the story. But the thing about nowadays, by the way, it's moving in a good direction. And in searching for jobs, for example, they would very much say, her or him. And sometimes it's him and her, and sometimes it's her and him. So it's actually moved into a better kind of situation now. And now it's much more holistic. So, every now and again, sort of it's weighed on one side or the other. But I think in the general sense, at least in terms of terminology, there's a higher sensitivity. And by the way, in any language where you have male, female consciously brought to you in language, you have to work very hard to make sure that it doesn't discriminate in one direction or the other.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, I want to thank you for being with us for the month. It's so much information to think about. And so I want to thank Jake, our awesome producer, Cantor Jake. Thank you so much. And we have next week off. We start on June 7th. I'm doing actually the first class, but then after that with an incredible rabbi who's also, we're blessed to have part of her synagogue, visiting the sick and comforting the bereaved with Rabbi Steve Moss. And I'll be doing that first session June 7th. So stay safe and well Memorial Day weekend for America. And Paul, stay safe and well. And thanks to everybody. And thanks, Jake. Take care. Be